So again, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Most of my life, as I move from place to place, I kind of feel out of place. And here, young researchers, can't check that. Computing, I can't check that. Everybody here but me does theory, so I can't check that. So it's just, like every other day in my life. This is joint work with Xiang Hui, who's at WashU in the marketing department, Mariam Saidi, who's at Carnegie Mellon in the economics group, and Giancarlo Spagnolo, who's at this institute in Sweden that's also an economics group. And this is based on work that came out at the time where Mariam and I interacted a bit at eBay, and then this just morphed on. So in terms of the question that we're asking here, I'll just pull this out so I can pay attention to time. We know that in markets, you often will have asymmetric information. In online markets, that's particularly prevalent. And we know that with asymmetric information, you're going to have market failures, sometimes even complete market breakdown, as in Akerlof 1970. And we also know that there are market mechanisms that help alleviate this problem of asymmetric information, some of which, for example, are the dynamics of reputation. You behave in certain ways if you know your behavior is tracked, because then in the future, that will either attract or dissuade buyers from interacting with you if you're a seller. Another solution is the idea of certification, where a trusted third party could come and basically give you some kind of document or certification that says, you're a good person, you should be trusted. And then that certifying agency has that long-term reputation to do a good job, otherwise their services will not be trusted and will not carry any value. Examples of that are the Better Business Bureau in the United States, or hygiene grades that restaurants get in different cities, and others. And there's a nice survey of this literature, and it's quite a large literature, where Dave Dranov and Ginger Jin write, from cradle to grave, consumers rely on quality disclosure, namely some sort of certification, to make important purchases. And here we see examples of how this looks in the modern e-commerce marketplace. So on eBay, you have these badges, top-rated seller. By the way, how many people here have ever bought anything on eBay? Just out of curiosity. Okay, yeah. Airbnb, you have Superhosts. Upwork, which is an online marketplace for labor, like freelance labor, they have top-rated freelancers. And this is basically an attempt of the marketplace to put a badge on certain sellers and say, these sellers pass some threshold. You could trust them. That's the idea behind it. Now, here's what it looks like on eBay, which is where the data we're going to use comes from. Imagine you did a search for an Apple iPod, and then you're going to get a list of items that the search algorithm pops out, and for some sellers, you're going to get that top-rated badge. So you know that certain sellers are going to stand out because of that badge. Now, if we think about the badges, clearly we see the pro, which is if that central certifier, that agency, is going to indeed be able to measure some quality threshold and say certain people are above the threshold, that alleviates that asymmetric information problem. At the same time, that also has a potential negative impact, and that could be a barrier to entry, right? So imagine that Michal is a very established seller, and she already has the badge, and now I come in as a new seller. I might be great, but because of that badge, people might worry and they might not want to buy from me, and that is going to affect my incentives to enter and my potential for growth and so on. So the questions that we ask in this paper is, let's imagine that we have a certification system. You have a certain bar that the certifier is setting, and above the bar versus below the bar. What happens when you raise the bar? Okay? Or vice versa, what would happen if you lower the bar? So what are the incentives going to be for new sellers to enter the market when that bar is higher? What are going to be the incentives of incumbents to exit the market when that bar is higher? And we're going to look at the effect of the quality of incumbents who are going to experience this change in the bar. And finally, the quality distribution of sellers in this market in terms of an equilibrium outcome. The approach that we're going to take is we're going to develop a very simple model, as in the simplest model possible. We were surprised that there wasn't an off-the-shelf model to just pull out and use and take to the data. So I'm going to go through that model with some care because I think it may be of interest to people here in the audience. And then we're going to use a policy change that happened at eBay in order to take this model to data and see if we could establish that the predictions of the model indeed are borne out in the data on the eBay platform. So I'm going to try to split my time between these two and talk a little bit about the subtleties in the data analysis. In terms of the overview of the results, just in case I don't get through everything, then first of all, in terms of the model, what happens when you raise the bar? Well, let's start with something that's almost trivial. Could I use that? Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. I hate standing in one place. Then the first thing is, imagine you have a whole spectrum of quality. Now you take a bar and you just raise the bar. Well, the average quality goes up everywhere, right? Because it's harder to be on top, and people who used to be on top are now on the bottom. So, averages go up on both sides. The thing is that that's going to encourage entry on certain parts of the spectrum, because entering at the top becomes more attractive, and the people who are at the very top are going to benefit from that. Entering at the bottom becomes more attractive, and the people at the bottom are going to benefit from that. People in the middle, those are the ones who are hurt, because they used to be able to be in the upper group, and now they fall in the lower group, and they lose some of those incentives. It will, however, increase the effort by some of the people in the middle for whom it's not too expensive to stay above the bar. Right? They're willing to put in that effort in order to increase their quality, and this is going to raise the prices for those who benefit and reduce prices for those who suffer. The thing that makes the model neat in terms of an application to data is if you could rank markets by how much they're affected, and I'll be very clear by what I mean by how much they're affected by a policy change, then all these results get amplified for markets that are more affected. So then if I could rank order markets by how affected they are, I could then rank order how these effects are going to be borne out in the data, and that's something that I could test in the data, namely entry and prices and even something related to behavior of sellers. In terms of the data, the approach that we're going to take is what we call a continuous difference in difference approach. So for those who are familiar with or less familiar with the difference in difference analysis, the idea is we make a change in some place and then we don't make a change in the other place. Over time, many things could change. We're going to use the place in which no change happened to measure the time effect. Then we're going to look at the time effect in the place where the change did happen, and we're basically going to difference one from the other to get the effect of the change itself and not other time varying inputs. Here, the way we're going to do it is that idea that different markets are impacted differentially, and we're going to use the strength of the impact as that difference estimator, and I'll get into the details. We're going to confirm that we have fatter tails of entry, and that's the idea that quality, that entrants benefit both at the top and the bottom end of the distribution and not in the middle. We're going to be able to confirm the price effects that we talk about, and we're actually going to be able to say something about selection versus effort. Namely, if you think of models of asymmetric information, you have the moral hazard type where people could work harder or less hard, and you have the adverse selection or hidden information part. Every time I think about that, I remember that Paul has an unpublished paper from 1980 that you could think of these two as isomorphic, but in terms of behavior, they do have some differences. And we'll be able to tease some of that out. What we can't pin down without distributional assumptions that we've basically made a decision not to make is whether you will have more or less entry overall. This we could look in the data, and there seems to be temporarily more entry, but it fizzles away and seems to equilibrate. Whether overall quality will be higher or lower depends on the distribution. In the eBay case here, we do have higher quality that seems to be long-lasting. And we really can't say much about welfare effects, but we could do a quick back-of-the-envelope analysis and see whether welfare seems to have gone up in this eBay marketplace. So this is what the paper does, and unless there are any questions, I'll start ramming through the model. Okay, so think of a supply side where you have a continuum of sellers who can each produce one unit at zero cost. So extremely simple technology. Their heterogeneity is going to come in two sources. First, there's going to be some entry cost K that's going to be between 0 and infinity, nicely distributed with the continuous distribution function that's differentiable, even though we don't really use that. And that is the entry cost heterogeneity. The second type of heterogeneity is going to come from the hidden type and hidden action. So we're going to follow a cute little model, a variant of a model by Doug Diamond in 1989 with the following structure. Imagine you have a measure mu L of sellers who can only produce low quality L. You have a measure of mu H sellers who can only produce high quality H. And these are the two fixed types, okay? And now we introduce a third type who could choose whether or not to be high types or to not do anything costly and be a middle or medium type. And here's the idea. If they shirk at zero cost, so they don't do anything, they could produce medium quality M that lies between H and L. If they exert effort, they could imitate high types and produce the high level of quality. But there is a heterogeneous cost of effort for these medium types. And again, that runs between 0 and infinity with a distribution function f that is, again, well behaved. So what we have here is that the L and H types just have this fixed quality, and their heterogeneity is all coming from the entry costs. The medium to the strategic types, the strategic sellers, they have two dimensions of heterogeneity. They have the entry cost K, and they have the effort cost E. Okay? So this is the supply side, and we're done with that. Yes?
What is known? What is private?
I'm going to get there. So first I'm going to describe the kind of underlying fundamentals, and then I'll talk about the information. Yes, of course.
Does this model capture the problem of cheap pseudonyms, or like that people can exit and enter with different...
So the model we're taking here is fully static. So we're not going to take any dynamics into account. In principle, you could extend this to be a dynamic model, and then if people could, exit and then re-enter, I know a paper on that from about. Well, they also wrote a paper on that, yeah. But my PhD dissertation. So I think we could incorporate that. I don't think, at least from a quick thought about how this works, yeah. Friedman and what's his name? I'm forgetting his name. He had a co-author on that paper. It's actually a cool paper, Games in Economic Behavior. So, okay, this is the side of supply. Demand side, it's going to be trivial. So the buyers here are just playing an equilibrating effect. So we have buyers who value the quality of the good. They're willing to pay up to the expected quality. I'm going to assume that they're on the long side of the market, so all the surplus goes to the sellers, and therefore price is going to equal expected quality. So that's, buyers have no interesting action going on here. And finally, the information, to your nice questions, buyers do not observe sellers' quality directly. The market regulator, this third party, right, eBay, they do observe the seller's quality, and the market regulator can produce a badge B. And for this simple model, where I only have three types, L, M, and H, the badge could either be M or H, and the badge certifies that the quality of whoever carries the badge is at least B, the badge quality. So we're going to have a stringent badge, H, where if you get it, it means you're of the highest quality, and if you get a badge M, your quality could either be medium or high. Okay, so that's how the information works. And the equilibrium is going to have the following notation. For any bar level B, which could be M or H, P upper bar B is going to be the price for the badge sellers.
P lower bar B is going to be the price for the unbadged sellers, so upper bar, lower bar. And then V, same thing, is going to be the average quality. And of course, in equilibrium, P upper bar B is going to equal V upper bar B, and P lower bar B is going to equal V lower bar B. So that's all the inputs that go into the model. It's very straightforward. When I get to the analysis, I'll say a few words of, we're pretty confident. We kind of played around with it, but we never dotted the I's and crossed the T's. Instead of a three-type model, think of a more smooth model where you have every seller has an inherent type, say theta, and an effort E, and quality is theta plus E. Okay, and then basically everything is nice and smooth, and you could raise the bar anywhere you want, and people are going to respond. So when I get to the results, I'll tell you why we are pretty confident that this would extend quite naturally to that setup. So let's start with the obvious result of what happens when you have a bar that is M, which is the lowest possible bar. So you know, it's even overkill to call this a lemma. All S-types, the strategic types, are going to shirk, namely they won't put in any effort in any equilibrium where the bar is medium, and it's obvious they have no benefit from putting in effort. Effort is costly, they get the badge for free, and that pins down a unique equilibrium. So all the S-types who enter are going to shirk. The prices are going to equal the quality. So let's start with this side, which is straightforward. Since anybody who doesn't have a badge is not medium or high, they have to have a low quality. That's going to be the price for not having a badge. And the price for having a badge is going to be a convex combination of the medium or the strategic who aren't working and the high types. Mu S, remember, is the measure of the strategic. Mu H is the measure of the high types. So it's basically a Bayes updated value of the mix between the medium and the high types. And the reason it is exactly weighted by their size in the population, by their measures mu, is because if you think of the low types, right, the mu LM, where M is the low badge, mu L for the low types, is going to be G of L. Remember that G is the distribution of the entry costs. L is the price that they get. So the entry costs have to be below the price, otherwise they don't enter because they can't overcome the entry costs. So this is exactly going to determine in that distribution times mu L, which is the total measure of the low types. And then both the medium and the high types are going to have the cutoff of G of P upper bar M, right, this higher price that has to overcome their entry costs, and again multiply that by the relevant size of that population. So we get a very simple equilibrium. So I'll pause here for a second. Is this pretty straightforward? Are we good? Okay. Okay, so with the high bar, you know, a little more sweat, but it's still quite straightforward. So let's start with the lemma, which is that in equilibrium, some of the strategic types are going to exert effort whenever the badge is high. The intuition is very straightforward. If the badge is high, we know that there's always going to be a premium between having a badge and not having a badge. That's just always true. Because that cost of effort E runs from 0 to infinity, you have some S-types for whom the cost of effort is infinitesimally small, and they get a benefit, so you have to have in equilibrium some of them putting in effort. And now, with that in mind, we know that we're looking for a cutoff effort cost, that people below that are going to put in effort, people above it won't. Some of them are going to enter with effort, some will enter without effort, and then everything has to equilibrate so that prices equal quality. And it turns out that there will be at least one equilibrium, and I'll show you in a second how we work that out. If you have a badge now, of course, your quality has to be high. If you don't have a badge, you're going to be a convex combination of the low types and those medium types who have a low cost of entry but a high cost of effort. And that's going to determine the price of not having a badge. And in terms of the behavior, the S types of sellers who will be badged will be so if and only if they choose to exert effort, because otherwise they cannot get H. And we already took these off of the proposition. So to show you what this looks like in a pretty intuitive way, recall the strategic types have two dimensions of heterogeneity, the costs of entry and the cost of effort. So let's start with people who have a cost of entry that is below P lower bar H, whatever that will be in equilibrium. We know that if they enter and put in no effort, they're making money because their entry cost is less than the unbadged price. Now, if their effort costs are very low, then in fact, they would rather work than not work because H minus P upper bar H is the premium they get from working instead of not working. So here you have a group of folks that are going to work, and then everybody with higher effort costs is just going to enter and shirk and still cover their entry costs. Anybody with an entry cost above H, there's no way they could cover their entry costs because this is the highest price they could get. So all these folks are going to shirk, exit, remain out. And now we just have this nice linear 45 degrees line because here you have the trade-off between effort costs are low enough that if I enter, I want to work, but I will only enter if the price that I'm able to get will cover my entry costs, and then you have this nice separating line here. So we basically have that the strategic types are going to fall into three groups. Those who choose not to enter, those who enter and shirk, and those who enter and work. With that in mind, we could prove that there's an equilibrium by looking at that function, which is the quality of unbadged sellers. Okay, so these are the sellers who enter and are unbadged, which is going to be a mix of the medium who choose not to work and the low types. And that is basically going to depend on P lower bar H, which is that price in equilibrium. So this is basically a response function to a certain price, and now we have to verify that that price is what will make it an equilibrium price. If that price is L, it's very low, then this VH is going to be above L because remember, some medium types are going to enter because their entry costs are very low. If that price is M, then this V lower bar H is going to be below the 45 degrees line because you have some of the low types that come in, and that lowers it below M. And it's going to have to cross at least once because that function is continuous. Whether it is unique is going to now depend on the G and the F, and again, we said we're not going to make any assumptions on that. So if it would cross more than once, all of them are going to be above L because, it always starts above L, and that's why we're going to have an equilibrium with higher quality and higher prices. So this is how the model works. So what do we get out of this model, and why do we find it useful in terms of going to the data? So first of all, corollary one, P lower bar H is less than P upper bar M, which means that whenever you raise the bar, some of these S types are going to lose their badge. And again, it's very intuitive because if I had a badge and now you made it more hard to get the badge and my costs of effort are high, I'm going to lose the badge. Maybe I stay in if my entry costs are low, maybe I choose to exit. Second is prices are higher for both L and H types, and that's because when you're raising the bar, you're raising the average quality above and below the bar. So for the H types who are always on the top and the L types who are always on the bottom, prices are going to go up. And for folks in the middle, these S types, some of them, because of corollary one, are going to lose the badge and suffer a price drop. And finally, if you are a strategic type and you do keep your badge, the only way you could do that is by producing higher quality. That's straightforward. So that's kind of the design of the policy, the effort effect that we get here. The fourth one is, hold on, is the one that's the most interesting in terms of the data implications. So let me state it carefully. So let market A have a higher measure of S types than market B. So let me pause there for a second. Imagine we did the following thought experiment. We have mu L low types, mu S strategic types, and mu H high types. Now imagine we just take that mu s and make it bigger, okay? So if we do that and we fix the measure of L and H types, then a change from a lax, that's an M, to a stringent, B, H badge, implies more entry of L and H types in market A, and therefore it has fatter entry tails. And the idea really follows from the fact that that increase is happening both below and above the bar. That increase is going to be larger because of what happens with that measure of S types. And this is central to what we call the identification strategy, how we're going to tease out the impact of this effect in the data that we have. In terms of the idea of implementing this to data, imagine that some market lost more badges than another market. What does that mean? That means that the market that lost more badges had more people sitting around that boundary that suddenly moved. Then that means that a larger measure of S types were affected, and the distributional impact of the policy should be more severe in the market where more S types lost their badge. So that's exactly how we're taking this to the data, and that's how I want you to think of what I'll mean by different markets. So just have this in mind when I go to the data analysis. Yanai.
So you only care about the measure of S types, not about the measure of S types with efforts around?
So in this model, it's only the measure of S types because if the measure of S types increases keeping the distribution F of the effort, that means you're also going to have more S types who are going to lose their badge. Okay? So that's why I say take everything else equal. You're absolutely right that more broadly, you do need a change in the number of people that are going to lose their badge. Otherwise, this wouldn't hold. Okay? Okay. So the comparative statics of the model's predictions, quality and prices increase for both badged and unbadged sellers. The distribution of entrant sellers' quality will have thicker tails, and conversely, if we have exit, the distribution of exiting sellers will have thinner tails because it's the people in the middle who have the incentive to exit because they're losing the badge and they're losing those benefits. The incumbents that choose to retain their badge naturally have to increase their quality. And across markets, in more impacted markets, meaning they lost more badges, more S types, there will be a larger impact on the tails of the quality distribution of entrants and exits. Like I said earlier when I described the main results, we cannot predict changes in total entry rate because that's going to depend on the distribution functions that we're not going to try to uncover. We cannot have predictions on the average quality of entrants because some are higher, some are lower. And like I said, the welfare effects, we're going to need to make assumptions on distributions, on consumer heterogeneity, and there's no limit to how many assumptions we could make and try to analyze things. It's just I'm not sure I would believe the results that we would come up with. But we will do some analysis because we have the data and we could look at these things. So let me describe the data. So the good news is we have awesome data. The bad news is it's proprietary, so we cannot share it. As a footnote, one of the things that I've become very passionate about is to try to get more private sector data out into the public sector, just because the quality of the data is amazing. And with another set of projects that me and other co-authors did with eBay data on bargaining interactions, which is almost literally like a Rubinstein bargaining game in the way the protocol is done, we managed to get a huge data set of about 80 million bargaining listings, of which about 22 million of them have bargaining threads with active buyers and sellers. We managed to get that public after a year and a half of working with the eBay lawyers. I can't talk to the eBay lawyers now for several years because I've been doing work for Amazon. But I'm hopeful that more of this will happen. I'll also say well, no. This is this is interesting, and I'll spend just 2 minutes talking about that. And of course, I could look at Moshe and say Microsoft has data, right? But one of the things that was a nice change, and this is maybe less interesting for this crowd, maybe some of you are in the ML area as well. Mike Jordan from Berkeley recently joined as a part-time Amazon distinguished scholar and built a small lab in Berkeley with his students. And part of the agreement was they have to be able to at least have a path for publications. Unfortunately, and this is when I was at Amazon for a year full-time, this is a battle I had almost daily and I lost. The economists are not as open to letting the economists publish at Amazon compared to the computer scientists. I do not understand why. But there is at least an appetite to have a conversation now. So I'm not going to say I'm super optimistic, but what I am a bit optimistic about, and if this does work, this would be amazing. I'm on this advisory board of let's call it a think tank called the Luohan Academy, Luohan, which was founded by Jack Ma from Alibaba. And the beauty of Alibaba is eBay and Amazon and PayPal, and it's all together. And they are very open to creating a interface where researchers could come and use data and maybe even make some scrub data public. It's still in its infancy, but I'm cautiously optimistic that now, of course, from everything I've seen, if you don't have a Chinese co-author, don't even try. But if that does happen, I think that would open the door to many interesting work. So going back to this, we have proprietary data from eBay. For all the transactions we have, and I'll describe them, we have information on the product attributes, the listing features, the buyer history, the seller feedback and reputation. eBay has a product catalog. Interesting, this was developed here in Netanya when eBay bought shopping.com. And they have about 400 or more, a little over 400 subcategories that are exhaustive. So for example, fiction and literature is one subcategory. Fresh cut flowers is another category. Laptop computers, so on and so forth. We're going to treat each subcategory as a market, so that when I go back to that comparative statics, market A, market B, this is where we're going to get that differentiation from. For some of the goods, we have what's called product IDs. And we're going to use these to do a more apples-to-apples comparison. For example, iPhone 6 black, 32 gigabytes unlocked, right? And I'll tell you what we do with that. And finally, we have data on a seller's first listing, and that's for us going to be the entry date. So that's how we're going to treat entry of a seller into this market. The variation that we're going to take advantage of, so maybe a small subset of you know that economists are very religious about causation versus correlation, unlike machine learners, but I'm not going to get into that argument here and now. So the idea of getting a clear causal estimation of an effect means you have to have some random reason that things changed, okay? And the random thing that happened was that in September 2009, eBay changed the policy for certification. In terms of the facade, it's not just facade, they changed from the power seller badge to the top rated seller. But of course, for there to be a raising of the bar, something else must have happened. And indeed, this is what happened. The old power seller badge had requirements. You have to sell a minimum number of items or money, and you have to have 98% positive feedback, and no less than 4.6 out of 5 detailed seller ratings. Now, for some of you may have seen some work I did on eBay's reputation mechanism. 98% is like the 10th percentile of sellers. This really is not very stringent. This is not too stringent either. Where the real change comes from is basically down here. So the new eBay top-rated seller badge requires everything they had previously plus more sales. These two is where the bite comes from. Less than 0.5% of low detailed seller ratings, which is 1 or 2 stars, and less than 0.5% of buyer complaints. And what this does, it makes it significantly harder to get that badge. Now, of course, if this would be true, you would have to see a drop in the number of badges that were there. And here you see the exact change that happened. So before September 2009, you kind of hovered between 8 and 10% of sellers with badges. Right after the policy change, it just plummeted by more than half. And then slowly over time, it went back close to the levels, but not quite where it was. So you see about 18 months post the change. So clearly there was a real impact on the badges. Now, what we're going to do in terms of the empirical strategy, we're going to take what we call a two-staged approach. In the first stage, we're going to rank markets from more or less impacted, and then take the view that markets that are more impacted are markets where more sellers were in that middle range where they lost their badge. And then we're going to look at the different distributions of quality market by market in order to test the empirical implications. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate the policy exposure, and we call that beta C in each category C. And remember, a category for us is a market: flowers, laptops, etc. We're going to apply the new certification requirement on the badge sellers and see the drop in the badge sellers. And then markets where there was more of a reduction in the badge sellers, these have more affected sellers, and they're going to be differentially impacted. So here what you see is just a diagram that shows the distribution of those beta Cs. How much were markets impacted, right? On one hand, you know, over here you have basically 400 different lengths. Okay, that's beta. You have markets that were hardly impacted up here. So for example, uniform and worker clothing is one of the ones where that impact was less. Somewhere in the middle, autographs, souvenirs, and memorabilia's beta was as high as 0.28. And then the highest betas were even a little bit above 0.5, that more than half of them lost their share. Tripods and supports, wholesale lots, there was a big impact there. So these are going to be our differentiated markets that we're going to look at. The second stage.
Beta doesn't capture the fraction of badge people in that market, only the change in the fraction.
It's the change in the, exactly, right. And then what we're doing is we're going to do this difference in difference estimators. So Y is going to be a variable of interest, let's say the number of entrants, or the quality distribution, or the quality of incumbents. And then we're going to regress that on the policy, which is a dummy, 0, 1, before or after the policy change, times the beta. So if you have a higher beta, you were more impacted, and the theory says the gamma that we estimate should be, for example, bigger if we're looking at the distribution of quality. And that's what we're trying to uncover, is the value of that gamma, okay? And then we have market fixed effects and time fixed effects to absorb some of that variation. So this is the idea of the empirical exercise. Now, of course, one of the things we're interested in is quality. And how do we measure a quality of a seller? So here I'm just pulling some facts that I mentioned in a second out of some previous work that I did with Chris Nosko. So some people might say, well, eBay has a reputation score. For example, 98%, 99%, 83%. Let's maybe use that as a quality measure. Well, over here you see a snapshot of the distribution of percent positive on eBay, and the median is 100%, the mean is 99.3, and the 10th percentile is 97.8. So not a lot of variation here. What Chris and I did in that other work is we conjectured and then confirmed the following idea. And there's actually a paper that had a similar idea with a different econometric technique a few years ago by Chris Delarocas and Charles Wood. We are going to treat silence, namely not leaving feedback, as a negative sign. So if you're a buyer and you buy something on eBay, you could leave positive, neutral, negative feedback, or you could leave no feedback. And if you look at two sellers, say seller A and seller B, that both had 99 positive feedback, 1 negative feedback. According to eBay, when you look at the eBay page, they're going to have the same percent positive, which is going to be 99 divided by 100. But imagine that seller A has a silence of 20 and seller B has a silence of 50. Then, according to our measure, which we call effective percent positive, seller A is a lot better than seller B because A has 99 divided by 120 and B has 99 divided by 150. Now, of course, I have to prove to you that seller A is of a higher quality than seller B. With the paper with Chris, we did two things. One is using a revealed preference approach. We looked at buyers who bought from sellers. Buyers do not see the effective percent positive, so they can't self-select on it. And we looked at the probability that a buyer returns to eBay as a function of the EPP and anything else we could measure. And we found that higher EPP sellers cause buyers to come back more to eBay. The second thing we did, we actually were able to run a randomized controlled experiment where we manipulated the search algorithm that eBay used. And some buyers during a 2-week period saw higher EPP sellers on the search page. And then we measured 3 to 6 months later, they returned to eBay with a higher probability. So we feel pretty comfortable with this measure. Yes, Michal?
What about EPN, effective percent negative, because that seller A here has
Yeah.
a lower EPN?
That's true. But the reason that the negatives are very uninformative because there are very, very few of them. Okay? So here's our theory of the world. There are two types of people. There are people who always leave feedback and they always leave truthful feedback, and there are not many of those. And then there are other people who leave good feedback when things are good, and when things are not that good, they prefer not to leave feedback. Okay? In that kind of world, over here, silence is going to have a negative implication. You could have a third type of people who are economists who don't leave any feedback because it's a public good, right? So they're just noise, okay? But that research did confirm that this is an adequate measure of quality. So this is what we're going to use, this EPP, as our measure of quality. I have about 5 minutes, am I right? Okay. This is the distribution of EPP. So, it looks like a signal, and like I said, it does predict returns. So let me go through the results pretty quickly. I told you our model cannot predict averages without looking at the distributional assumptions, but we could look at what happens on average. So the effect on entry and the quality of entrance. So we have that entry went up, but 7 to 12 months later, the amount of entry was the same as it used to be before. So we're looking dynamically at the amount of entry in any given period. But the quality of entrance using EPP went up and continued to stay higher than it was before. So, like I said, the model is not going to predict either one way or the other. That depends on the distribution. This is what the model does predict. So imagine I have two markets, right, where I say, H and K, and I have these distributions over here. So, sorry, I have this lower and higher decile, for example. Then what's going to happen is the deciles are going to expand because I have higher incentives to enter on the top and higher incentives to enter at the bottom. The incentives to enter drop in the middle. Okay? So this is the empirical result that we could take to the data. And here's what you could see. The change in the effective percent positive for entrance in the different quality deciles, both overall and then with the difference in difference market by market, we see this nice monotonic or almost perfectly monotonic relationship. We don't have a lot of statistical significance, borderline here on average, but here when we look market at market using the difference in difference, we get statistical significance at the top. We get the monotonicity, but borderline statistical significance down here on the second decile. So the pattern is consistent with what the model suggests. And We could look at the flip side, which is exit, those incumbents that leave the market. We see them monotonically decreasing. We do get some significance at some parts of the tails, but again, the signal-to-noise ratio is not huge. The pattern is at least consistent with what the model suggests. In terms of the response to incumbents, and here I want to go through this very quickly, we see that on average you're not getting anything. The incumbents don't seem to raise their quality. But remember what the model says. That is only going to happen around the bar, right? If you're way down here, the costs of effort are too high. If you're way up here, you don't need to do anything. It's only the people around the middle who are going to do anything. So what we do next is we divide the incumbents into 4 groups. Those who, at the policy change, right, that's what we're looking at, those who didn't have a badge and still don't have a badge, those who had a badge and still have a badge, they're unaffected. It's the ones who had a badge and lose their badge that are the ones that are more interesting. You also have a very small group of people who didn't have a badge and then got a badge, but that's just a timing issue. They were going to get a badge anyway because the badge is given, with some delay. So we see that we're getting some action for the people who didn't have a badge, who had a badge, and they would lose their badge after the policy change. So that's as the model would predict. But now we could unpack this even a little more, because for those who lost the badge, there are going to be 2 types. Those who lost the badge and it's too expensive for me to regain it, and those who lost the badge and it's not too expensive for me to regain it. And here you see those who lost a badge and within 3 months didn't regain a badge versus those who lost a badge and within 3 months did regain a badge. And here we have a huge effect, and here again we have nothing. So you kind of very clearly see the people who give up and the people who work quite a bit harder, but they're a very small percentage of the population. So when we look at the changes in quality, when we looked at those distributions, it's mostly coming from entry and selection and less so from effort that is changing. So effect on prices, we get what the model predicts. If we look on the people who kept their badge, big increase in the price. If we look at people who didn't have a badge and got a badge, we get a large impact on price plus minus 3 months, plus minus a month. We just don't have enough data here. And the people who lose their badge, they are the ones who lose on the price as well, the price of the goods that they get. This is where we use that data that I told you is apples to apples, product by product, because otherwise there's too much variation to do this. So, since I am out of time, I am going to quickly conclude. How does raising the bar affect entry and quality? In more affected markets, we have higher quality with fatter tails. Parenthesis, because the model could go either way here, but that's what the model predicts. Improved selection and higher effort at the margin. What are the implications for digital platforms? Well, you are affecting the quality distribution when you're playing with a bar. And now if you have knowledge on the demand side, if people are more interested in dispersed quality or if they're more interested in being kind of okay, I don't care if it's great, I just don't want it to be too bad, that has implications of where you want to set the bar. I didn't talk about welfare. What we did is we looked at the auctions and we looked at the difference between the first and second bids, assuming people bid truthfully. That increased, which suggests that we have a little more surplus. So that, again, could have gone either way. In the eBay case, it seems that welfare improved. And I'll stop there.
Maybe time for one more question.
So you had a slide where you had all these categories sorted from least effect to most effect, and I'm a bit confused about what I should take from that slide, because the way you framed it, it sounds like I should conclude that the categories more down that slide have a higher percentage of S-types, but That's, according to comparative statics, that's only if I believe that each of these categories has the same measure of low sellers and same measure of high sellers and some distribution of effort and all that kind of stuff. So it's unclear to me what to make of it.
So
I'm sorry, you should come back.
yes. So what Yanai asked. Oh, sorry. What Yanai asked is, when I displayed the comparative static result, I said fix the L and H types, right? And now mark and fix the distributions and all that. And now when I change the bar, if I have more lost badges, that means I have like a higher measure of those. There's a one-to-one.
Different categories to begin with, you have different measures.
Absolutely. So the key is, and this is the way we're taking this idea to the data, is when you lose more badges, okay, it means that of the distribution of quality, you had more people sitting around that boundary, okay? And if you have more people sitting around the boundary, that means that the effect on the tails is going to be more pronounced. If you have fewer people sitting around the boundary, the effect on the tails is less pronounced. That's the key that we need in order to identify that. That's about the, exactly, yeah. In our simple model, it comes down to the measure of the types. But yes, it's all about how much action is happening at the boundary. Okay? Thank you very much.